So if you follow me at all in my writing and blog posting and videos, I talk a lot about the real estate industry news. I was really excited to get a chance to meet with a freelance writer who writes for some of the largest and most prestigious publications in the country on financial news. I read an article and saw an interview she did. As a freelancer, her article appeared in the Wall Street Journal. I have to be careful not to confuse what that means. And then she was interviewed by my good friend Kevin Bim on his Trust's podcast to explain it in detail. I'm really excited to have today freelance writer, yet very experienced with some great ideas on long-term care, Cheryl Munk. Cheryl, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So what prompts you to write an article? You're writing in the Wall Street Journal. Should you self-insure your long-term care? What is it that gets you to write that? Do you get assigned that? Is there somebody who says this is an important topic, or are you on your own go, this is interesting and I'm going to write on it?
So it really depends. It's hard to put a percent to it, but I would say that most of my stories are self-generated. But there are ideas that sometimes an editor will come to me and say, hey, would you write this for us? But many times I come up with the ideas. And a lot of times I just come up with things that I'm thinking about in my own life or that I think are relevant to people around me. And that's really the basis for things. I did a story a couple years ago now on getting your first credit card. And it was relevant in our life for my family. So that's how I come up with my ideas.
This particular topic on long-term care, is that something you came up with, or was there a family issue that came up? Can you describe the impetus on that one?
It wasn't a family issue, but I was just thinking about, what could I write that really has relevance? And of course, my ideas have to be accepted. So it's not just, and that's the trick, finding things that haven't been written about a gazillion times or finding a new way to write about it so that, that people will read the articles. And I started thinking about a family friend whose husband needed significant care. And when I was saying that, I hope that this isn't impacting your lifestyle, she was telling me how they had saved for years. They didn't do long-term care insurance, but they had saved for years and self-funded their care needs. And I said, I bet there are a lot of people in that situation who are thinking about what should we do? And that's how the idea for the story came up.
As I'm getting older, and fortunately, my wife had some medical issues, and I was literally having a conversation on this topic with my next door neighbor one day. I came back in and watched your interview, and I go, this is like hitting home. So I'm really glad to have the opportunity. In your article, you mentioned 70% chance that you have a need for long-term care. Anybody who turns 65 or older, 70% chance they'll need some sort of care, and 20% will need it for more than 5 years. Those are staggering numbers.
It's pretty crazy. But, if you think about the fact that Americans are aging, then it does make sense, right? When everybody was dying in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, then you didn't have these type of issues. And then, luckily, we do have the longevity is much better, but with greater longevity comes other issues, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's a give and take, and there's pluses and minuses of getting older. And one plus is being a grandparent, and then one negative is getting older to be a grandparent. I'm in that boat myself with my wife. So let's talk a little bit about the summary. How do you get to where you're able to write an article about this? Is it just your personal experience when you research it? How do you get to, because you have some really good points. And as somebody who works in the business all the time, I find you really on point with the right questions. How do you kind of assemble enough information to write with some sort of authority on the subject?
So, I've been doing this for a long time now, and I have, for many articles, I have a sense on how many people I'm going to need to call to get the information I need to understand the topic. Now, that's not always true, because sometimes there are harder topics I know less about. So it may be, give or take. And it also depends on the size of the article. My articles tend to be somewhere between 1,000 and, let's say, 1,500 words. And so, I'm going to be speaking to between 3 and sometimes 8 people. It could be more, it could be less, generally not less than 3, but it could be more. And it's hard to give an upper limit on how many I need to speak to, because it's just how much information I need. But oftentimes it's like having these conversations, it just kind of comes together. One question leads to, or one answer that a source will give me leads to another question, and that leads to another question. And just after a while, I just find that I'm able to craft a story. And I know I've done enough reporting when I can basically craft the story without having written it yet, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'll come up with my bullets. And so when I start out a story, I have no idea if I'm going to do it as a question, like I did for this particular story, or if it's going to be bullet point, kind of like 5 things you need to know about X, or questions to ask yourself. If those types of stories tend to resonate well with readers because they're like little bullet point, like little nuggets of information in each section. And I've been doing that format more lately. I find that that's something that readers really like. But as I'm reporting, it tends to come together, and I'm able to, and then as I'm writing, obviously I change things around, and sometimes like, oh, that doesn't work. I start out with 7, and then like, oh, it really should be 5 bullet points, or I start out with 5 and it should be 8. So it just kind of comes together as I go.
But it's digestible. So like the first point you had in your article was, who's a good candidate for self-insuring? I have a friend who is very wealthy from a long time ago, and saved diligently, put money away. And he just recently shared with me, unfortunately, both he and his wife had tremendous medical needs and care needs. He said, I thought I had enough. He said, we're not even close. And so who is a good candidate for self-insurance?
Well, I want to just preface this by saying, and I'm an expert to the extent that I wrote the story and talked to experts, but I'm not. I'm a reporter. So just like no one should should base their decisions based on what I'm saying. I wouldn't want anyone to make that mistake. I can offer in my stories some guidance for people to seek professional advice, but that no one should take what I'm saying as what they should be for sure doing. And the other point, and I will answer your question, but the other point I want to make is that a lot of times I think people make the mistake of thinking that self-insuring and not doing anything are the same thing. And that's not the case. And I think that that's a really important point to make, that either you're getting long-term care or you're deciding to self-insure. You're not doing nothing. You're doing something actively. And if that's deciding to self-insure based on your financials and your circumstances and what you think you're going to need, that's one thing. Just doing nothing is not a good plan.
Well, a general rule in self-insuring is that you're saving at least as much as you would in premiums set aside for that purpose, right? Or thereabouts, maybe, but not a lot less, because maybe there's a discount to the professionals doing it, but it's going to look something like that, right?
Yes, but people do tend to think of the idea that I'm, not paying for long-term care and I'm just going to have enough. That's not a decision to self-insure. That's just a decision not to do anything. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, it's 100%. It's like saving money. Like you could say you're going to save money, but until you have a separate account and you actually put money away regularly out of your paycheck or out of your business account on a regular basis, you're not really saving money. You have an idea you're going to save money, but you're not actually doing anything about it. It's the same thing.
Exactly. And so the idea here is that wealthier people generally are able to put more aside to be able, or to have sufficient assets to cover their future care needs. But that's a very big generalization, because what's wealthy, what's enough, and it's all going to really depend on, really so many factors: how long you live, what your health level really ends up being, what kinds of assets you have, right? If you have all, I think someone I spoke to had a really good analogy. If all your money is tied up in your residence, in your house, you're going to have to sell that house to be able to afford your care. So, or if like it's something illiquid, like a house is not as illiquid, but let's say that all your wealth is tied up in something like, I don't know, illiquid, I don't know, whatever the asset may be, you have to be really concerned, because then you're gonna have to sell that illiquid asset, and that's not so easy. So it's having a sufficient asset level, understanding your health needs, understanding how much you could need, and understanding the cost of care. That's also an important factor.
So I understand all those numbers. At some point, it becomes numbers, right? You have to have enough money set aside to cover those needs. If you say to yourself, well, my house will cover my future retirement home situation, as long as you're going to sell it and put all the money there, that's fine. But if you're using that money also for other things, that's where the problem comes into play.
Exactly. But there's also the flip side of it. And now several readers reached out to me afterwards and saying, well, this is all well and good, but my insurance company keeps raising my premiums for long-term care insurance. And that's another factor. Sometimes you can get policies that are like what's it like? It's the wrong terminology, but I can't think of the word. It's static level, like where you're not going to see increases each year. you may see them at some point because whatever it is, but you'll see something steady, and the insurance companies do have to get permission to raise them. It's a whole thing that they have to go through. But in any event, you could potentially have premium increases, and then you have to factor that in as well.
Right. And a lot of the insurance just isn't available anymore that used to be. I know my neighbor, he and his wife bought long-term care, and unfortunately she's had, 24/7 in-home care through this policy. And he said, we're lucky that policy doesn't exist today. Like there's just not enough money to pay for what this has been for her for the last, so far, like 4 or 5 years.
And there are a lot of exceptions, and not every policy is created equal. So those are factors as well.
Right.
But I think it's actually interesting. So one person said to me, and I think that that's actually an interesting point, is that, you don't necessarily have to get the Cadillac policy, and you can do a little bit of both, where you're getting a policy that you think is going to serve your needs to at least some extent, and then you can self-insure the rest of it. So that's a way to kind of take the middle of the line path.
Where I get involved in this topic is that there's certain planning to be done to allow you to take advantage of certain government programs. If you have more than certain assets, you're not qualified. If you have less than, you do qualify. And there are people who take those assets ahead of time and plan in a way that provides for their family, but doesn't strip them of the benefit, and yet they qualify for programs. Is that something that you came across in your research at all?
It's really not something I dealt with in my research now.
Very detailed estate planning, I know, and probably mean more so in California than in other states where we have a probate process that's a little more cumbersome. So I know you're in New Jersey, so a little different. So let's talk a little bit.
Much better probate process than California, from what I understand.
So you have a better in New Jersey?
Much easier probate process than California, from what I understand.
It's interesting because I think, first off, I think all states are better than California in general government regulations, but I think part of it also is the lower price points translate to less fighting over the assets. Part of the problem in California is any house that's standing today that's habitable in the city of Los Angeles is going to be $500,000, $600,000. And you put that much money on the table, people are going to fight for it to the death. If that same house sold for $200,000 or $300,000, there's half the money, net of expenses, even lower amount, there's less to fight over. So part of it is the nature of the business, and part of it is the values we have in California, which are subject to taxing and all that. So it all kind of works out the same. Let's talk a little bit about the business of real estate, real estate news, because one of the things that I talk about regularly is not so much because you're freelance, so you're different, is more the process of the industry of real estate, where companies in real estate like Redfin and Zillow put out data, and it creates kind of an echo chamber where they put out information, but then all these news agencies report on their data. The data is always something that's beneficial to the corporate interest. So it may not be helping a buyer or helping a seller, but it's helping them position themselves in the marketplace, and it goes through. And so talk a little bit about the difference between a freelance writer and when you're a staff writer, say for Wall Street Journal or CNBC or some of these other institutions. What's the difference in responsibility, or are there any, as far as or ethics or things like that? Where does that line get drawn, or is there a difference?
There's no difference. And the difference in terms of the sources I use and the professional ethics, the difference is just I'm not a salaried employee, but I'm subject to the same ethical standards. In fact, the contracts I sign say that I can't just go off and, use AI or ChatGPT, for example, to write stories, nor would I, but I'm saying that that's not something that I could do. I'm not allowed, there are certain kinds of, I'm not allowed to get paid in certain, by sources, for example, that I write about. Sometimes people will say to me, hey, can I send you a free copy of my book? And the answer is no, you can't. I mean, it's very nice of you. Thank you for offering, but no, you can't. I'm not allowed to accept those things. So
wow, even a book.
Some reporters might take those things. I really take a very hard line that I don't want any appearance of impropriety. And so if I want the book, I'll buy it. If it's something that I need for my reporting for whatever reason, and it usually is not, but let's just say it was, I would purchase it. But it certainly wouldn't be something I wrote about or telling them that I bought the book. It's not that's not acceptable.
One of the things that happens, I don't know how freely you are, and so you're welcome to excuse yourself, but I got to ask the question that happens in our industry is I see that big companies, and notably that I write about regularly, Redfin and Zillow, put out data that get run by news websites But those same news websites are running and promoting the brand, yet also take advertising dollars from the same companies, where in fact, in the largest advertisers on their website are the same people that they're parroting the news or echoing the news or citing their data as news. To me, that seems like an inherent conflict that you can't do as a writer, but the website's doing it as part of their business model. What am I missing?
I mean, not much, but I don't get involved in that because I mean, there's different parts also of media organizations these days. There are parts of media organizations that will do content writing for corporate clients. That's just a way that they've started doing that business. But that's something like some of the organizations that I work for that have done that in the past have had very strict lines where if you were writing for that content side, you couldn't write for the journalism side. Again, I know people do walk both lines and maybe they don't care. I'm very careful not to write about companies that I have a vested interest in. I mean, some of for example, I can't own stocks in the companies I write about.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and that's not necessarily true of every organization. I really couldn't. I just can tell you from myself and the organizations I write for, there are very strict rules. And even if they're not, I keep those strict rules.
So I would imagine as a consumer of news, you must have an eagle eye for some of these lines that are being crossed or some of these areas of ethical challenges. So what advice would you give to readers who are trying to learn about buying a house, selling a house, navigating probate, estate planning? What advice should you give them when they read the news to be discerning and make sure they're getting real information and not just being fed advertising?
So it's interesting. A lot of times, and I read publications like this also, you'll see that like where someone will have a column on estate planning and it'll be written by an attorney. And I think that people just have to understand where the person is coming from when they're writing the story. So if it's and I see this in real estate also, like 10 reasons why it's great to buy a house. Well, that's wonderful. But if it's a real estate agent writing that story, look, I had a discussion with my family weeks ago about media bias. I don't think it's fair to say that there's no media bias, that it never exists, because we're human, like reporters are human, and there is inherently some bias, right, wrong, or indifferent when you're writing a story. You have some opinion because you do. The challenge as a journalist, in my opinion, is to keep your opinions out of it and present the facts. So when you're looking at a story, you have to understand that may be in a publication that doesn't have such an anti-bias or that isn't trying to take the middle of the line approach. You have to understand who is giving you that information. Is it someone who has a vested interest? And that's why even in the sources I choose for my stories, I try very hard to find people who don't have an interest. So in this life insurance story, this long-term care insurance story, I tried very hard. I at the very least asked the advisors I spoke to, do you sell a long-term care insurance? And the answer for one of them was that they will do it if the client asks, but that wasn't enough on them. But it was like so few that it wasn't, to me, it didn't seem like a huge conflict of interest. Because you could see if someone is selling long-term care insurance and someone is saying, you should always buy long-term care insurance. We never tell our clients to self-insure. Well, that's not a good source for me, because I need someone who's going to tell me both sides of it.
Right. They might be a great vendor to buy insurance from because they believe in the product and they're committed to getting you your results and all that. They're just not going to get, if you don't fit, they're selling hammers. If it's time for a screwdriver, they're not going to tell you not to use a hammer. They're just going to hit it with a hammer anyhow.
But you have to be careful also because you realize that they're making a commission. So if someone is for the life products or for the long-term care products, they're making a commission. So, and I'm not saying that you can't sell these products I'm not saying that you're out to get everybody or you're out for yourself, because these advisors do have fiduciary responsibilities in many cases. But at the same time, people need to know, whether they're reading an article or whether they're working with people, what those biases they may have are.
So you may not be able to answer this question because you have customers here, but when you're looking for news, let's say in an area that's new for you and real, maybe you're deciding should we buy a house or not buy a house, or should we invest in real estate or not, the areas I work in, or should we engage an attorney for estate planning? Where do you research? What are your, which as a consumer, not as a writer, where do you look for information on those kind of topics? Financial, let's say, and specifically personal financial topics.
I mean, as a consumer, I just start with a Google search, a basic Google search, and see what comes up. And then I have a sense of, because I'm in the industry, what may be more reputable companies or information and not, and what may not be more reputable. I look to see whether they're selling me information, whether the same things I just said before, like, is it a real estate agent telling me that I should be doing this? Is it a company that may be paid somewhat by, that maybe they advertise with real, or agents advertise on the site, but it's written by an impartial source. And that might be a place I start.
Very good. Well, look, Cheryl, I really appreciate your time. Again, both on the topic of the long-term care, and then more, for me at least, my personal interest is much more on the news side and how you write it and how to understand it. So thank you so much for taking time with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.